In this video, we uncover some of the most disturbing true crime cases in American history, mothers who betrayed their own blood and committed unimaginable acts. These women weren't just convicted, they were sentenced to death. What drove them to commit such horrific crimes? Was it mental illness, desperation, or pure evil? Stay with us as we explore the dark truth behind these chilling stories, where love turned to violence and motherhood turned into murder. 1. Tierra Capri GOBBLE. Tierra Capri GOBBLE was just 21 years old when her name became known across Alabama for a crime that would shock even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. At the time, Tierra had no job and few social ties. Her life was already marked by hardship, a troubled upbringing, multiple children removed from her care, and a history of instability. On the surface, she was a young mother trying to reconnect with her children. But beneath that fragile exterior was a pattern of neglect, frustration, and emotional volatility that would come to a tragic end on December 15, 2004. Tierra's early life remains largely undocumented, but court proceedings revealed a background of childhood abuse and neglect. She was described as emotionally fragile, and by the age of 21, she already had several children. After multiple allegations of abuse, Florida's Child Welfare Agency removed all of them from her custody. Her infant son, Phoenix Cody Parrish, was placed with her great-uncle Edgar Parrish under strict orders not to allow Tierra access to the child or to leave the state. Both conditions were eventually violated when Parrish relocated to Alabama and allowed Tierra and her boyfriend to move into his home. The situation quickly unraveled. On the morning of December 15th, Tierra entered Phoenix's room and found him unresponsive. She summoned a friend, Tori Jordan, who alerted Edgar Parrish. He called 911, but it was too late. Phoenix had died from extensive injuries. An autopsy revealed skull and rib fractures, broken wrists, and signs of repeated trauma. Medical professionals testified that such injuries would have required immense force, and Phoenix would have been in immense pain before his death. Initially, Tierra told investigators that Phoenix had been fussy and difficult to soothe. She admitted to accidentally striking his head against the crib and claimed she might have gripped him too tightly in frustration. But conflicting statements and physical evidence painted a darker picture. In court, her friend Tori testified that Tierra once said, "If she couldn't have her children, no one could." A handwritten letter presented at trial contained the line, "It's my fault that my son died, but I didn't mean for it to happen." The jury found Tierra guilty of capital murder. Despite the defense presenting her abusive childhood and mental health history as mitigating factors, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. On December 1, 2005, the judge upheld their recommendation. Tierra became one of the few women on Alabama's death row. Psychological evaluations and court opinions noted her emotional instability, unresolved trauma, and possible resentment toward a system that had taken her children away. Yet experts and jurors alike agreed this was not a crime of sudden rage, but a prolonged pattern of abuse. The court described her actions as especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, emphasizing the defenselessness of the victim and the breach of maternal trust. And perhaps that is what lingers most. Not just the horror of what happened, but who it happened to and who committed it. A child, a mother, and a final act that left a quiet crib, a grieving family, and a justice system grappling with the cost of preventable tragedy. "It's my fault," she wrote. But was it also the fault of every missed warning sign, every failure to intervene, every second chance ignored? 2. Christie Michelle Scott. Christie Michelle Scott was 30 years old when her life and the life of her 6-year-old son took a horrifying turn. A licensed insurance agent living in Russellville, Alabama, Christie seemed like a typical small-town mother. She was married to a local bank executive, had 2 young boys, and was active in her community. But beneath the image of a suburban family life, there were signs of deep emotional and psychological unrest. Raised in nearby Haleyville, Christie came from a respected family. Her father was an insurance agent, and her background offered her privileged stability and expectations. But those who knew her closely described her as overwhelmed and emotionally distant, especially in her relationship with her older son Mason, who had autism. While many families rally around children with special needs, those close to Christie noticed a lack of warmth and an undercurrent of frustration. On August 16, 2008, at around 2:30 a.m., emergency services responded to a house fire at the Scott residence. Christie appeared frantic, holding her youngest son Noah and crying that her house was burning. But what she didn't say right away was that Mason was still inside. By the time firefighters reached him, it was far too late. Mason had died from smoke inhalation and thermal burns. In the hours and days that followed, investigators noticed troubling inconsistencies. The smoke detector had been tampered with. Fire patterns suggested an accelerant may have been used. And most disturbing of all, just one day before the fire, Christie had taken out an additional life insurance policy on Mason, bringing the total coverage to $175,000. The investigation intensified. Christie's past became relevant. She had been connected to multiple previous fires, including one that destroyed a former home. During the trial, her father confirmed that Christie had been involved in at least 3 past incidents. Though she claimed innocence and said the fire was accidental evidence mounted, she placed personal belongings with a family friend the night before the fire, and inconsistencies in her timeline couldn't be explained away. Christie was arrested in October 2008, and her trial began the following summer. The jury found her guilty on 3 counts of capital murder, including murder during arson murder for monetary gain and the murder of a child under 14. Though the jury recommended life without parole, Circuit Judge Terry Dempsey overruled the decision and sentenced Christie to death, making her one of the few women on Alabama's death row. Psychologists pointed to motive rooted in financial desperation and emotional detachment. Christie's behavior suggested calculated intent, not mental illness. There was no diagnosis of psychosis, no delusions, just a slow, chilling erosion of empathy until a life was extinguished for money. To this day, Christie maintains her innocence. Her appeals continue, but each has so far been denied. In the quiet cell at Julia Tutwiler Prison, she awaits her fate alone, far from the suburban image she once portrayed. The last thing Mason Scott ever saw was the bedroom where he slept, a place he should have felt safe. And the person he trusted most turned out to be his greatest danger. What drives a mother to such betrayal? The answer, perhaps, is one we may never fully understand. 3. Diane Lynn Marsh. Diane Lynn Marsh was 39 years old when she was arrested on March 22, 2007, in Tucson, Arizona. A former medical secretary and Air Force veteran, Marsh had once been described as soft-spoken and devoted by members of her church. To the outside world, she appeared as a struggling single mother trying to raise her autistic 5-year-old son, Brandon Williams, after divorcing his father. But behind closed doors, that image would collapse under the weight of secrets too painful to imagine. Marsh's early life offered no signs of what would later come. She served more than 9 years in the Air Force and later worked in healthcare. But over time, things began to unravel. Diagnosed with fibromyalgia and depression, Marsh was eventually unable to work. Her life grew more isolated. She pulled Brandon out of school in 2006 and stopped cooperating with Child Protective Services. By the time she invited 2 homeless acquaintances, Flower Thompson and Mark Moss, into her home, Marsh's world had grown increasingly unstable and dangerous. Brandon's death didn't happen all at once. According to court records and testimony, it came after months of mistreatment. He was given adult doses of over-the-counter sleep aids, tied up and reportedly scalded. Marsh claimed she was under the psychological control of Thompson, who she said had convinced her they were being targeted by a satanic cult. In this delusional framework, Marsh believed her son was in danger from outside forces, yet the real threat was already inside the home. On the night of his death, Thompson called 911 to report that Brandon had stopped breathing. He was rushed to the hospital, but could not be revived. Though initial suspicions pointed to a medication overdose, the autopsy revealed a fractured skull and internal bleeding. His body also showed signs of repeated injuries, healing bruises, marks on his wrists and ankles, and skin lesions suggesting past trauma. Marsh was arrested the same day. During questioning, she admitted to tying Brandon down and giving him high doses of sleep medication, but denied causing the fatal injury. In court, she pointed blame at Thompson. Prosecutors, however, believed Marsh snapped under pressure and emotional strain. The jury found her guilty of negligent homicide and 4 counts of child abuse. Though originally charged with first-degree murder, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison in September 2008. The courtroom was filled with grief and disbelief. Brandon's father, Melvin Williams, described the pain of imagining his son wondering why his own mother was hurting him. The judge was blunt, calling Marsh's actions torture and holding her directly responsible for Brandon's death. Despite her tears and expressions of remorse, the court found no comfort in her defense. Experts never diagnosed Marsh with a severe mental illness. Her behavior seemed to stem more from emotional breakdown, delusional thinking, and a dependence on toxic relationships than from psychosis. Some described her as malleable and easily influenced, but not unaware. In the end, Brandon was a vulnerable child, dependent on the one person meant to protect him. And that trust was irreparably broken. As the judge told Marsh at sentencing, his blood is on your hands. That haunting truth still echoes for those who remember Brandon, a boy who, in his grandmother's words, only needed someone to talk to him. 4. Connie Villa, on Christmas Day 2013. What should have been a day of celebration turned into an unthinkable tragedy in Casa Grande, Arizona. 35-year-old Connie Villa, a mother of 4, was arrested after a chilling series of events left her eldest daughter dead and 3 younger children hospitalized. At the time, Connie was a stay-at-home mom, recently divorced, and living in a modest apartment complex. Outwardly, she was seen by neighbors as quiet, polite, and loving toward her children. But behind closed doors, Connie's world was unraveling. Born in 1978, Connie had been married to Adam Villa, a member of the Arizona Army National Guard. They shared 3 children, while her eldest, Aniarael Matias, was from a previous relationship. In earlier years, the family had shown public signs of joy, especially when Adam returned from deployment in 2006. But following their separation, tensions over custody appeared to grow. Connie had primary care of all 4 children and was increasingly fearful that she might lose them, particularly to her ex-husband. According to police, it was that fear which drove Connie to commit her crimes. Investigators later said she told them she didn't want her children to live with their father. On the morning of December 25th, she attempted to make that a reality. Police reports indicate that Connie forced her 3 youngest children, then aged 3, 5, and 8, to ingest prescription narcotics. But when 13-year-old Aniarael refused to comply, Connie suffocated her with her bare hands in the bathroom. Later that evening, she lured her ex-husband Adam to the apartment. When he arrived, she stabbed him multiple times in the torso. Despite his injuries, he managed to escape and drive himself to the hospital, calling 911 on the way. Police arrived soon after and were forced to break into the apartment. Inside, they found Connie, with self-inflicted stab wounds, clutching a knife, and standing beside her 3 surviving children. Aniarael's lifeless body was discovered in the bathroom. Connie was immediately taken into custody and treated at a local hospital before being booked into jail on charges of first-degree murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The toxicology reports confirmed that the 3 younger children had traces of opiates in their systems, though they all survived and were later placed in the care of their father's family. Connie was held without bond, and at her arraignment in January 2014 pleaded not guilty. In interviews, Connie claimed she believed her children were in danger if they were placed in their father's custody. Yet authorities dismissed her reasoning as delusional and manipulative. Psychological assessments from the case have not been made public, but her actions suggested a combination of emotional instability, possessiveness, and an overwhelming fear of losing control. Anyariel's family described her as a gentle, kind spirit who loved her siblings and always had a smile. Her life was cut tragically short by the very person she trusted most. And while the legal process continues, one haunting question remains. What causes a mother to turn on her own children? Sometimes the greatest dangers aren't outside the home, they're within it. 5. Christina Marie Riggs. Christina Marie Riggs was 26 years old when she was arrested in Sherwood, Arkansas, on November 5, 1997, just one day after smothering her 2 young children in their beds. A licensed practical nurse and single mother, Riggs was known to friends and co-workers as quiet, polite, and deeply protective of her children. But beneath that calm surface, she was unraveling, emotionally exhausted, financially overwhelmed, and privately battling severe depression. Raised in Oklahoma, Riggs came from a troubled home. She later claimed to have been sexually abused by a stepbrother and a neighbor during childhood. By her teenage years, she had turned to alcohol, marijuana, and relationships she described as desperate attempts for love. At 16, she gave birth to a child she placed for adoption. She later became a nurse trying to build a stable life, but her relationships continued to crumble. By the mid-90s, she was divorced, working long shifts and raising 2 children, 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby, almost entirely on her own. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Riggs's life was collapsing. She struggled with childcare, was behind on bills, and had been arrested for writing bad checks. She told her mother she was simply tired, but inside she was making a deadly plan. She would later say that she believed taking her children with her in death was an act of mercy, a way to spare them from abandonment and pain. On the night of November 4, 1997, Riggs gave her children a small dose of a sedating antidepressant. Once they were asleep, she attempted to inject Justin with potassium chloride, a substance used in lethal injections, expecting a quick, painless death. But the drug, undiluted, caused intense pain. Justin awoke, crying out. Riggs tried to calm him with morphine, but when that failed, she smothered him with a pillow. With Shelby, she avoided the injection and used the pillow alone. She then placed the children side by side on her bed, covered them with a blanket, and wrote suicide notes. She swallowed a lethal amount of pills and injected herself with potassium chloride, intending to die beside her children. But the next day, her mother found her unconscious and alive. Christina was rushed to the hospital and arrested upon her release. In court, Riggs pleaded not guilty by reason of mental illness. Her defense argued she suffered from severe depression and post-traumatic stress, but the prosecution insisted her actions were calculated and self-centered, describing the children as inconvenient to her. The jury deliberated less than an hour before finding her guilty of 2 counts of murder. At sentencing, Riggs stunned the court. She refused to let her attorneys present mitigating evidence. She looked at the jury and said plainly, "I want to die. I want to be with my babies." The jury granted her wish. She became the first woman executed in Arkansas in over 150 years. On May 2, 2000, Christina Riggs was put to death by lethal injection. Her final words were filled with sorrow. "There is no way, no words to express how sorry I am. I love you, my babies." To the end, she believed death was her punishment and her only chance at peace. 6. Debra Sue TUGGLE. Debra Sue TUGGLE was just 26 years old when she was finally arrested in March 1984 in Little Rock, Arkansas. A former mental patient mother of 5 and caretaker to her fiancé's children. TUGGLE was charged with murdering 4 children, 3 of them her own, and suspected in the death of a 5th. Her arrest came not after a single tragedy, but following a chilling pattern of unexplained child deaths spanning nearly a decade. TUGGLE grew up in Arkansas, where her early life remains largely undocumented. What is known is that she struggled with mental illness throughout her young adulthood and was briefly institutionalized after a suicide attempt in 1978. She had 5 children by different fathers in the span of 11 years, often living in unstable housing and relying on public assistance. To the outside world, she appeared reserved, soft-spoken, and even maternal. Neighbors saw her as quiet and devoted to her children. But behind that image, a disturbing reality was unfolding. Between 1974 and 1982, Debra's children began dying one after another. First, in 1974, her 2-month-old son, Thomas Bates, died, followed just months later by her 21-month-old son, William Henry. In both cases, doctors attributed the deaths to pneumonia or sudden infant death syndrome, commonly known as SIDS. In 1976, a 3rd son, Ronald Johnson, died at just 9 months old, again ruled SIDS. Each tragedy was mourned in isolation, but no one connected the pattern. In 1982, Debra moved in with her fiancé, George Paxton, under the pretense of helping him care for his 3 children. But just months later, his 2-year-old daughter, Tomekia, was found unresponsive. Debra claimed she didn't know what had happened. Initially, the cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but that conclusion would soon be questioned. The turning point came in late 1983 when Dr. Alexander Merrill, a state mental health official, noticed a disturbing trend: 5 children with different surnames, all deceased, all linked to the same woman. Coroner Steve Nowojcik launched an investigation that led authorities to reopen the case of Tomekia Paxton. A re-examination by the medical examiner determined she had been deliberately suffocated. In March 1984, Debra Sue TUGGLE was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. At trial, TUGGLE admitted to holding a pillow over Tomekia's face to stop her crying while she watched television. She claimed she didn't realize the child had died until later. The jury convicted her of 2nd-degree murder, sentencing her to 10 years in prison, the minimum under state law. Charges related to her 3 sons were dismissed due to insufficient evidence and expired statutes of limitations. She was released in 1994 after serving just a decade behind bars. No formal motive was ever presented. Some experts speculated that Debra may have suffered from a form of Munchausen syndrome, by proxy a psychological disorder in which a caregiver harms children to gain sympathy or attention. Others believe her actions stemmed from deep-seated emotional instability and a lack of maternal attachment. Still, one haunting fact remains: over the course of nearly 10 years, 5 children died under her care, and the system failed to intervene. As one coroner bluntly stated, "It scares the hell out of me that someone could get away with killing 5 people over 8 years." Debra Sue TUGGLE didn't hide in the shadows. She walked freely among neighbors and nurses, appearing as any other mother. The question that still lingers is how many red flags were missed before the truth was finally uncovered. 7. Jessica Nicole Bradford. Jessica Nicole Bradford was 23 years old when she was arrested for the murder of her newborn daughter in November 2011. At the time, she worked at the Julian Youth Academy in Whitmore, California, a private Christian boarding school for troubled teens. Known by staff and students as responsible and soft-spoken, Bradford had earned a reputation as a role model, someone who offered guidance and support to others. But in a devastating twist, the woman who helped young girls navigate hardship was quietly facing a crisis of her own. Bradford was adopted as a child and raised in a conservative Christian home. She often spoke of her faith and the importance of moral purity. That image, however, became a heavy burden when she found herself pregnant outside of marriage, a situation she kept secret from nearly everyone around her. Not even her parents' co-workers or longtime boyfriend knew the truth. For months, she hid the pregnancy behind loose-fitting clothes and silence. According to investigators, Bradford gave birth alone on September 19, 2011, beneath a deck on the school campus. She later told detectives the baby girl was alive, crying, responsive, and full term. Rather than seeking help or medical care, Bradford kept the baby hidden from the world. Over the next 4 days, she fed her nothing more than drops of water from her fingertip. Eventually, the baby, later named Lily, died of starvation. For nearly 7 weeks, Lily's body remained hidden in a laundry basket inside Bradford's dorm room. When co-workers discovered the remains while looking for a blanket, they immediately alerted authorities. By the time police arrived, the infant's body was mummified. Bradford initially told investigators the baby had been stillborn, but under questioning, she admitted the child had lived for several days. She said she had wanted to give the baby up for adoption, but was paralyzed by fear of losing her job, fear of disappointing her family, and fear of disrupting her carefully crafted image. Surveillance footage showed her shopping with her boyfriend just hours after giving birth, buying alcohol, while the newborn remained hidden nearby. In June 2014, a jury found Jessica Bradford guilty of first-degree murder after just a day and a half of deliberation. The prosecution argued that her actions were deliberate and premeditated, citing her failure to seek help and her statements about weighing her options. The defense claimed she panicked and lacked support, but jurors were unmoved. Bradford was sentenced to life in prison. Psychological experts did not present a formal diagnosis, but prosecutors emphasized Bradford's detachment. She had not named the baby until forced to do so after the autopsy. In her own words, she said, "If I named her, it meant she was real." Jessica Bradford's story is not one of rage or sudden violence. It is a chilling portrait of silence, denial, and emotional paralysis. In the end, it wasn't just what she did, but what she failed to do that ended an innocent life. And as the courtroom closed on her fate, one question remained: how could someone so trusted, so admired, become the architect of such a quiet tragedy? 8. Dora Luz Buenrostro. In the fall of 1994, Dora Buenrostro, a 34-year-old mother of 3 living in San Jacinto, California, made a 911 call that would launch one of the most shocking and tragic cases in the region's history. When police arrived at her apartment, she claimed her estranged husband had entered the home with a knife. But when officers entered the residence, the truth was far more devastating. 2 of her children, 9-year-old Susana and 8-year-old Vicente, were found lifeless inside. A third child, 4-year-old Deidre, was missing. Later that day, her body would be discovered in an abandoned building 10 miles away, still strapped into her car seat. Dora Buenrostro had no prior criminal history. To neighbors, she was a quiet woman, a mother doing her best in a difficult separation from her husband, Alejandro. But in the weeks leading up to the murders, Dora had grown increasingly erratic. Family members later testified that she seemed angry, emotionally distant, and often unstable. Some described her as paranoid, claiming she believed people around her were changing or becoming inhuman. There were whispers that she might have been using drugs, though no evidence of substance abuse was confirmed in court. The killings occurred over a span of 3 days in late October 1994. Prosecutors alleged that Debra, the youngest, was killed first, stabbed in the neck, while still strapped into her car seat. Her body was abandoned in a post office west of town. 2 days later, Dora killed her remaining children as they slept in their living room. She then drove to the local police station and falsely claimed her ex-husband had threatened the children. But her story quickly unraveled. Alejandro Buenrostro had a verified alibi. He was in Los Angeles at the time. When confronted, Dora's account shifted multiple times. Investigators found blood evidence in her car and belongings. Faced with overwhelming contradictions, she was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The trial that followed took a heavy emotional toll on everyone involved. Prosecutors painted a picture of premeditation and vengeance. They argued Dora killed the children to punish her ex-husband and escape the responsibilities of motherhood. The defense, however, raised questions about her mental health, suggesting she suffered from psychosis or delusion, though she was found competent to stand trial. During the penalty phase, Dora took the stand against the advice of her attorneys. She denied everything. Instead of showing remorse, she blamed the police, her lawyers, and the justice system, claiming she had been framed. Jurors, many of them parents themselves, were visibly shaken. Some wept. Others described her outburst as the moment they knew she could not be spared. On October 2, 1998, Dora Buenrostro was sentenced to death. She remains one of the very few women on California's death row. To this day, she maintains her innocence. But as juror Tia DeRico later reflected, if she had said, "I did it, I'm sorry, I loved my children," it would have made it easier to choose life. But there was nothing. The question that still haunts the case is not just why Dora killed her children, but how a mother with so many chances to choose differently ultimately chose silence, blame, and denial. 9. Socorro Caro. On November 22, 1999, Socorro Caro, a 42-year-old wife and mother of 4, committed one of the most disturbing crimes in California's recent memory. That night, in her family's quiet Santa Rosa Valley mansion, she took the lives of 3 of her sons, 11-year-old Xavier Jr., 8-year-old Michael, and 5-year-old Christopher, each shot while sleeping in their beds. Her 4th son, an infant, was left unharmed. Cora then turned the gun on herself. She survived the self-inflicted wound, but her life and her family's would never be the same. Caro was born in 1957 and married Dr. Xavier Caro, a prominent rheumatologist practicing in Northridge, California. To the outside world, they appeared successful, wealthy, educated, and raising 4 children in a luxurious home. Cora worked as the office manager in her husband's practice, managing finances and supporting his medical career. But behind closed doors, the marriage was fracturing. Testimony would later reveal a deeply dysfunctional relationship marked by emotional volatility, suspected infidelity, and rising tension. According to several witnesses, the couple's relationship had been deteriorating for years. Cora had reportedly lashed out at her husband during past arguments, at times violently. In the days leading up to the murders, she had learned that Xavier was contemplating divorce. Prosecutors argued this triggered a devastating chain reaction, one fueled by resentment control and an unwillingness to lose what she perceived as her identity, wife and mother. On the night of the murders, prosecutors said Cora methodically shot each of her sleeping sons in the head with a .38 caliber handgun. Afterward, she attempted suicide but survived. She claimed the brain injury erased her memory of the events. From the beginning, Cora maintained her innocence. Her legal team argued that her husband committed the murders and framed her, but the evidence told a different story. Forensic reports and ballistic analysis pointed squarely to Cora. The trial was long and emotionally taxing. Jurors heard heartbreaking details from investigators and medical experts. They also listened to conflicting testimony from both sides of the family. Some relatives stood by Cora convinced she was being wrongfully accused. Others, including Dr. Caro, insisted she had committed the murders. The couple's surviving son, an infant at the time, was placed in his father's care. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Socorro Caro on 3 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, the jury determined that she was sane at the time of the crimes. On April 5, 2002, she was sentenced to death, one of the few women in California's history to receive that sentence. The judge called the murders willful, premeditated, and committed with malice aforethought. Psychological assessments offered no definitive diagnosis. Cora's attorneys claimed she suffered from a mental breakdown. Prosecutors said her actions were deliberate and rooted in revenge. In court, Cora lashed out at her husband, shouting, "How could you do this to us?" A final cry that blurred guilt denial and unresolved pain. The tragedy of the Caro family leaves behind more than unanswered questions. It forces a haunting reflection on the hidden fractures within seemingly perfect lives. And in the silence of that mansion, the memory of 3 young boys will always linger, reminding us that even within the walls of privilege, darkness can take root. 10. Carol Coronado. On May 20, 2014, a quiet home in Torrance, California, became the center of an unthinkable tragedy. Carol Coronado, a 30-year-old stay-at-home mother, was arrested for the deaths of her 3 young daughters, Sophia, aged 2.5, Yasmin, 16 months, and 2-month-old Xenia. The girls were found carefully placed side by side on a bed, their mother lying next to them, covered in blood. She was alive but injured, having apparently attempted to take her own life. Carol was known by friends and neighbors as loving, attentive, and devoted. She had served briefly in the U.S. Army after high school and was working toward furthering her education while raising her children. There were no public signs of abuse, neglect, or violence, but behind the scenes, something had been unraveling. According to her husband, Rudy Coronado, there had been subtle yet persistent changes in Carol's behavior. She was exhausted, emotionally withdrawn, and had become increasingly overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood. Unbeknownst to him, Carol may have been suffering from undiagnosed postpartum depression or even postpartum psychosis, a rare but serious condition that can affect new mothers. She was reportedly taking an antidepressant and an anti-anxiety medication at the time of the murders. That day, Rudy was outside working on his car. Inside the home, something went terribly wrong. According to investigators, Carol stabbed each of her daughters and then attempted to take her own life. When her mother arrived at the house, she discovered the grisly scene and called 911. Deputies arrived to find Carol naked, disoriented, and holding a knife. She was immediately hospitalized for self-inflicted wounds. The community's reaction was one of overwhelming shock and sorrow. Neighbors remembered seeing Carol walking the children down the street just days earlier. Family members described her as a devoted mother, and yet the evidence left little room for doubt. Several knives were recovered from the scene. Blood was found on Carol's hands and body. Her daughters were no longer alive. Carol was charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder for allegedly trying to harm her own mother. Prosecutors included special allegations of multiple killings and the use of a deadly weapon, leaving open the possibility of the death penalty. At the time of this recording, Carol remains in custody awaiting trial. She has pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Experts brought in by the defense have pointed to potential postpartum psychosis, a condition characterized by hallucinations, delusions, and a disconnect from reality. Carol's husband has remained publicly supportive, calling her a great woman who was overtaken by something beyond her control. She doesn't deserve to be where she's at, he told reporters. This wasn't her. Mental health professionals continue to debate whether Carol's actions stemmed from untreated illness or something more complex. But one fact remains indisputable. 3 young lives were lost in the span of a single afternoon in a home where they were supposed to be safe. And in the words of a grieving father, one question continues to echo. Why did this happen? A question without clear answers, only heartbreak. 11. Brandy Lee Rose DEVINE. Brandy Lee Rose DEVINE was 25 years old when her name became tragically etched in the public's memory. A mother of 4 from Turlock, California. Brandy lived in a modest duplex on North Denair Avenue. On the surface, she appeared to be an overwhelmed but loving parent, juggling the responsibilities of a young family. Her daughter Stephanie Torres, just shy of her 3rd birthday, had been born prematurely and suffered from cerebral palsy, a condition that required regular therapy and attentive care. For a time, Stephanie had been making slow but meaningful progress, learning to sit up, crawl, even feed herself. But in July 2012, that progress came to a devastating halt. Behind the closed doors of that home, Brandy had begun using methamphetamine. According to authorities, she spent nearly 3 full days under the influence, locked away in a haze, while her daughter Stephanie remained isolated in a back room. Deprived of food, water, and medication, the child was left alone in her crib, surrounded by cats without any attention or care. On July 16, 2012, a neighbor heard Brandy screaming. When help arrived, they found Stephanie unresponsive in her crib. Despite efforts to revive her, it was too late. The pathologist would later testify that Stephanie had died from dehydration and malnutrition. At the time of her death, she weighed just 13 pounds, more typical of a 1-year-old than a child approaching 3. Her body showed unmistakable signs of neglect. The home was filled with the odor of animal waste, and Stephanie's room was cluttered with filth. Brandy admitted to police that she had not opened the door to her daughter's room since the prior Friday. Brandy was arrested that same day and charged with 2nd-degree murder, child cruelty, and drug use. During the trial, her public defender argued that while Brandy was negligent, she didn't fully understand that her actions or inaction would result in death. But the jury saw it differently. After just an hour of deliberation, they found her guilty of murder. In December 2013, Brandy was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. She stood in court offering an apology to her children and accepting full responsibility for her actions. No one spoke on behalf of Stephanie during the sentencing. The courtroom remained silent, perhaps an echo of the silence that had filled that back room for days. Psychological assessments indicated a lack of malicious intent, but pointed to extreme neglect fueled by substance abuse. Brandy told detectives she had assumed her 6-year-old child would take care of Stephanie, a justification that underscored her detachment from reality during that time. Whether her behavior stemmed from addiction denial or mental health issues remains a point of debate. What's undeniable is the outcome: a vulnerable child lost in plain sight. And in a final moment of clarity, Brandy's own words offered a haunting reminder: I hope they can forgive me one day. But for many, the question still lingers: how does a mother forget her child for 3 whole days? And why did no one stop it? 12. Marilyn Kay EDGE. On September 14, 2013, a hotel room in Santa Ana, California, became the site of a deeply unsettling tragedy. Marilyn Kay EDGE, a 42-year-old mother from Scottsdale, Arizona, had checked in with her 2 children, 13-year-old Jalen and 9-year-old Faith. The children believed they were visiting California for a vacation, perhaps even Disneyland. But within hours, both would be dead, fatally poisoned by their mother. Marilyn Edge held a degree in business and had worked as an analyst in the banking industry. Publicly, she appeared stable and educated. Privately, however, she had been locked in a bitter and drawn-out custody battle with her ex-husband Mark Edge since their divorce in 2007. The couple's disagreements, primarily over visitation and support, had been litigated for years in Georgia's family court system. Their son Jalen had autism, and Marilyn often argued that the father's involvement disrupted his progress and emotional well-being. 3 days before the murders, a Georgia judge issued a final ruling custody of Jalen and Faith would be transferred to Mark Edge. Marilyn was ordered to return the children by Sunday. But instead of complying, she packed them into her car and drove west away from Georgia, away from the courtroom, and it seems away from hope. At the Hampton Inn in Santa Ana, prosecutors believe Marilyn gave both children a lethal dose of poison, possibly mixed with food or drink. She then left the room. The next morning, she drove her car loaded with a propane tank into a power box outside a shopping complex in Costa Mesa. When police approached, she refused to get out and attempted to take her own life by strangling herself with an electrical cord. Officers broke the window and pulled her to safety. It was then that she told them where to find her children's bodies. Authorities arrived at the hotel room shortly after. Both Jalen and Faith were found dead. Toxicology results confirmed poisoning, though the specific substance has not been publicly disclosed. Edge was arrested the following day and charged with 2 counts of murder with special enhancements for multiple victims and murder by poison. She faces life in prison without parole or possibly the death penalty. In her first court appearance, Marilyn stunned the courtroom. When asked if she wished to delay her arraignment, she replied calmly, "Only if you promise me the death penalty." At that moment, it was clear she had no intention of defending herself. Investigators have since noted that Marilyn had been cooperative but emotionally detached. Her defense team described her as highly intelligent, but unraveling under the strain of legal and personal defeat. Some suggest the murders were an act of retaliation, a final irreversible rejection of the court's decision, and her ex-husband's role in their lives. At their funeral in Georgia, Mark Edge spoke softly through tears, "I walk away from the evil deeds of one and carry the grief of 3. The question left behind is not just why Marilyn Edge killed her children, but whether the system, the silence, and the years of conflict could have ever predicted the moment when a mother would choose to end her children's lives, rather than share them. 13. Susan Eubanks. On the night of October 26, 1997, in a modest home in San Marcos, California, 33-year-old Susan Eubanks carried out one of the most devastating acts in the city's history. A former nursing assistant and mother of 4, Susan shot and killed all of her sons, 14-year-old Brandon, 7-year-old Austin, 6-year-old Brigham, and 4-year-old Matthew. She then turned the gun on herself, surviving a shot to the stomach. Only her 5-year-old nephew, who was visiting that night, was left unharmed. Susan's life leading up to that night was marked by instability and emotional turmoil. Raised in a difficult family environment, she later endured years of domestic abuse and financial hardship. Twice divorced and raising 4 children, she had recently filed for separation from her second husband, Eric Eubanks. She was unemployed, battling substance abuse and burdened with debt. Those closest to her described a woman unraveling, angry, exhausted, and increasingly isolated. The catalyst came that day after drinking heavily and taking prescription Valium. Susan and her boyfriend, Rene Dodson, got into a heated argument. After slashing 2 tires on his car and disabling the phone lines, she locked him out of the house. Deputies were called to the scene, and Dodson left with some of his belongings. As he drove off, he warned Susan's ex-husband, Eric, that she had made alarming statements about killing herself and the children. Eric later received a chilling voicemail from Susan, just 2 words: "Say goodbye." When deputies returned around 7:30 p.m., they forced their way into the home. Inside, they found Susan bleeding, holding a towel to her stomach. Nearby, her sons had each been shot in the head with a .38 caliber revolver. The youngest, Matthew, was still alive and rushed to a hospital. He died the following day. Susan was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. At her trial, prosecutors argued the killings were deliberate, driven by a need to punish the men in her life. Evidence revealed she had written suicide notes filled with blame and bitterness. In one letter to her ex-husband, she wrote, "You betrayed me. I've lost everyone I've ever loved. Now it's time for you to do the same." The defense claimed Susan acted in a dissociative state overcome by alcohol, drugs, and years of emotional trauma. They painted a picture of a woman overwhelmed by failed relationships, mental illness, and the pressure of single parenthood. But the prosecution pointed to her actions, reloading the weapon, aiming at each child as calculated and conscious. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. In October 1999, Judge Joan Weber upheld their recommendation, the death penalty. Susan Eubanks was transferred to death row at the Central California Women's Facility, where she remains today. The loss of 4 young lives rippled through the San Marcos community, leaving behind questions that still haunt many. In the words of the presiding judge, this was not just a crime. It was a calculated and vicious act of revenge. And with that, Susan Eubanks became one of the few women in California sentenced to die, not only for what she did, but for who she chose to make suffer in the end. 14. Lashaun Ternice Harris. Lashaun Harris was just 23 years old when her name became linked to one of the most heartbreaking cases in San Francisco's recent history. A former certified nursing assistant and a mother of 3 young boys, she was known among family and neighbors as quiet, deeply religious, and devoted to her children. But behind that image was a woman in crisis, struggling with severe mental illness and falling through the cracks of a support system that failed her and her children. Born in 1982 and raised in Oakland, California, Lashaun had a difficult early life. She became pregnant as a teenager and gave birth to her first son at 16. Her family described her as shy and obedient, a girl who rarely got into trouble. As a young adult, she worked hard to provide for her children. But over time, her behavior changed, marked by outbursts of laughter, hallucinations, and disturbing religious delusions. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, she was hospitalized multiple times between 2004 and 2005. Doctors prescribed medication, but without consistent follow-up care. Lashaun's condition worsened. On October 19, 2005, Lashaun boarded a train from Oakland to San Francisco with her 3 sons, 6-year-old Trayshawn, 2-year-old Toronto Jr., and 16-month-old Joshua. They strolled along the Embarcadero, a popular waterfront area, and shared hot dogs. To passers-by, it seemed like a normal family outing. But what happened next defied comprehension. Witnesses later recalled seeing Lashaun calmly undressing her children near Pier 7. Her oldest son cried out, "No, Mommy, no!" But she continued. One by one, she lifted each child and dropped them into the San Francisco Bay. Toronto's body was recovered hours later. The other 2 were never found. When police found Lashaun, she was pushing a stroller filled with their clothes. When asked where the boys were, she said simply, "They're with their father." Investigators soon learned she had told multiple people that God instructed her to send her children to heaven. She even left behind crayon-colored letters to her sons, asking how heaven was and whether they were doing well. Her calm demeanor and disconnected statements at the scene led officers to suspect she was suffering from psychosis. Lashaun was arrested the same day and charged with 3 counts of murder. At trial, her defense attorneys argued that she was legally insane, suffering from untreated schizophrenia, and incapable of understanding the consequences of her actions. Prosecutors contended that while she was clearly disturbed, she still knew right from wrong. The jury ultimately convicted her of second-degree murder, but the judge later declared her criminally insane, sentencing her to 25 years to life in a state hospital. Mental health experts confirmed she experienced auditory hallucinations and religious delusions so powerful that she believed she was carrying out divine orders. Her IQ was measured at 69, placing her at the borderline of intellectual disability. The court ruled she lacked the capacity to understand the nature of her actions at the time of the crimes. To this day, Lashaun Harris remains in psychiatric custody. She continues to send letters to God and speaks of her sons as if they're still alive. One chilling question lingers: how many warning signs must be missed before intervention comes too late? Her story is not just one of tragedy, but of system failure, a haunting reminder that untreated mental illness can destroy even a mother's most sacred bond. 15. Theresa Jimmie Knorr. Theresa Jimmie Knorr was 49 years old when she was arrested in 1993. A mother of 6, she had once presented the image of a struggling but devoted parent. But behind closed doors, her home was a prison, and she was its tyrannical warden. What began as a pattern of verbal and physical abuse would ultimately end in the deaths of 2 of her daughters and the lifelong trauma of those who survived. Born in Sacramento in 1946, Theresa Knorr was the youngest of several children. After the death of her mother in 1961, her mental health began to decline. She married young, just 16 years old, and her first marriage ended in tragedy when she shot and killed her husband, Clifford Sanders, in 1964. She claimed self-defense and was acquitted, though she was already pregnant with her second child at the time. Over the next several years, Theresa had more children through 2 additional marriages. By the 1970s, she was raising 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, largely on her own. Publicly, she was seen as overworked and protective. Privately, she ruled with threats, violence, and a deepening paranoia. Friends and neighbors had little idea of the horrors unfolding behind the family's walls. As Theresa aged, her resentment toward her daughters intensified. She became convinced that they were trying to outshine her, accusing them of betrayal, jealousy, and even witchcraft. Her anger fell hardest on her middle daughters Susan and Sheila. The abuse they endured escalated into controlled confinement and eventually murder. In 1983, during an argument, Theresa shot Susan in the chest with a .22 caliber pistol. Miraculously, Susan survived, but her mother refused medical care. A year later, when Susan asked to move out, Theresa agreed, only if she first removed the bullet. What followed was an amateur surgery on the kitchen floor with a box cutter and liquor as anesthetic. When infection set in, Theresa labeled it a possession. She coerced her sons into helping dispose of Susan by burning her alive near Truckee, California. Less than a year later, Sheila met a similarly tragic fate. Theresa had forced her into prostitution and then accused her of giving her a disease. Sheila was locked in a dark closet with no food or water. She died days later, and her body was stuffed into a cardboard box and left on the side of a remote road. Theresa's youngest daughter, Terry, managed to survive. Years later, after escaping the family home and enduring years of silence, she came forward. In 1993, she told police what she had witnessed. Her account led to Theresa's arrest and the reopening of 2 long cold cases. Theresa Knorr pled guilty in 1995 after one of her sons agreed to testify. She received 2 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2027. Her sons received reduced sentences for their roles and Terry, once voiceless, became the key to unlocking the truth. Experts believe Theresa's actions stemmed from untreated mental illness, narcissism, and unchecked rage. But no diagnosis can fully explain the terror she inflicted on her own children. Terry once said, "She was our mother and our worst nightmare." It's a haunting truth that still echoes in the silence left behind. 16. Tanya Jamie Nelson. Tanya Jamie Nelson was 41 years old when she boarded a plane from North Carolina to California in April 2005. Her destination, the Westminster home of a well-known Vietnamese fortune teller named Ha Jade Smith. Tanya wasn't just looking for guidance. She had a plan, and it ended in tragedy. Nelson, born in 1964, lived in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. By all outward appearances, she was an ordinary woman, a mother, a friend, and a practicing Buddhist. But beneath the surface, she was a woman grappling with resentment, loss, and a burning sense of betrayal. Years earlier, she had sought out Smith's spiritual services. According to court testimony, Smith told her that if she moved her business from California to North Carolina, prosperity would follow. Instead, Nelson's life began to unravel. Her business failed, her finances collapsed, and she eventually lost her home. In her eyes, the fortune teller had misled her, and she intended to settle the score. On April 21, 2005, Nelson and her accomplice, 55-year-old Philippe Zamora, arrived uninvited at Smith's home. Under the guise of reconnecting, they were welcomed in. Smith and her 23-year-old daughter, Anita Vo, had no reason to suspect what would happen next. Using kitchen knives, Nelson stabbed Vo in the laundry room. When Smith began screaming, Nelson allegedly ordered Zamora to silence her. He later testified that he struck Smith with a bottle and then stabbed her multiple times. The two women bled to death just feet apart in their home. The crime scene was bizarre. The victims' heads and hands had been covered in white paint, an act that puzzled detectives. Some speculated it was symbolic, perhaps linked to Vietnamese mourning rituals, or meant to erase spiritual ties. Others believed it was a distraction, a dramatic gesture to mislead investigators. What was clear was that the home had been ransacked. Credit cards, jewelry, and cash were missing. Though strangely, some hidden valuables were left untouched. The day after the murders, concerned friends contacted police. Officers discovered the scene and began tracing the victims' financial activity. Within weeks, Tanya Nelson was arrested at a hotel in Santa Ana, California, after returning for a shopping trip using the stolen credit cards. In her possession were designer bags, IDs, and personal belongings of the victims. Zamora was arrested shortly after in North Carolina. Nelson was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances including murder during robbery, multiple victims, and lying in wait. In 2010, she was convicted and sentenced to death, making her only the second woman in Orange County's history to receive such a sentence. Zamora, who had testified against her, received 27 years to life in prison. Psychologically, Nelson's motive appeared rooted in a twisted sense of justice. According to Zamora's testimony, she believed Smith had ruined her life. Her sense of betrayal was so profound, she decided death was the only remedy. To Nelson, this wasn't just robbery, it was retribution. In her day, Planner authorities found 2 handwritten words on April 21st, the day of the murders. They read, "Horrible sin." Sometimes belief, when fueled by obsession, becomes something darker than faith. It becomes a motive. 17. Sandy Dawn Neves. Sandy Dawn Neves was 34 years old when she committed a crime that left California and the country stunned. On the night of June 30th, 1998, she set fire to her Santa Clarita home, killing her 4 daughters in what prosecutors would later describe as an act of calculated revenge. To those who knew her, Sandy was a devoted mother of 5, raising her children in the quiet suburb north of Los Angeles. Her life, however, was unraveling. Financial hardship, relationship turmoil, and a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband created mounting pressure. She had recently trained to become a police officer, hoping it might provide stability, but job offers never came. Beneath the surface of this overwhelmed mother was a woman consumed by anger toward the men who had left her. The courts she believed were failing her, and the life she felt slipping out of her control. In the weeks leading up to the fire, Sandy's personal life grew increasingly strained. She had separated from her husband, David Folden, and was fighting him in court over custody and child support. Just days before the incident, she was reportedly served papers indicating that Folden intended to revoke adoption of her 3 older children to avoid financial responsibility. It was a devastating blow. Friends would later describe her as isolated and deeply emotional. But no one could have predicted what she was planning. On the night of the fire, Sandy told her children they were going to have a slumber party in the kitchen. Her daughters, Jacqueline 5, Crystal 7, Rachelle 11, and Nicolette 12 climbed into sleeping bags and settled in for the night. Their 14-year-old brother David joined them. While the children slept, Sandy poured gasoline on the floor and ignited it. The blaze filled the home with thick, suffocating smoke. As the children began coughing and panicking, David later testified that his mother told them to stay put. By the time firefighters arrived, the girls had died of smoke inhalation. Only David survived. Sandy herself was found unconscious and taken to the hospital. She was arrested the following day. Her son's eyewitness testimony was pivotal in the investigation. He described her calm demeanor, her refusal to let the children escape, and her deliberate actions. She was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and arson. In 2000, after a 3-month trial and just 1 day of deliberation, the jury sentenced Sandy Nieves to death. The judge called her actions cold, vicious, and calculated. During sentencing, Sandy offered a brief statement saying, "If I could take back time, if I had been smarter, we would have gotten out." But prosecutors and jurors alike saw little remorse. Experts believed the murders were motivated by revenge and despair. Prosecutors argued she was staging a final act of retaliation, not just against her ex-husbands, but against a system she believed had betrayed her. Her son David now lives with his father. He has refused any contact with his mother since the tragedy. The letters she sends from prison go unread. Sandy Nieves became one of the few women on California's death row. And though the court imposed the ultimate sentence, no punishment can erase the echo of 4 small lives lost in the night. 18. Yolanda Guadalupe Peña. Yolanda Guadalupe Peña was 39 years old when she was arrested for the murder of her youngest daughter, 3-year-old Delilah Urrutia. A mother of 3 living in La Quinta, California, Peña had no criminal record, no history of public outbursts, and no signs that from the outside would hint at the unthinkable abuse taking place behind closed doors. But for months, Delilah endured a nightmare hidden in plain sight, until it ended in tragedy. Peña had been raising her daughters in a modest home on Vista Dunes Lane. By that summer of 2009, she was separated from her husband after a turbulent marriage. Prosecutors would later say that Delilah was the product of an extramarital affair, and Peña blamed the child for the breakdown of her family. Tensions inside the home were rising. At the center of it all was a quiet, often smiling toddler who bore the brunt of her mother's rage. The abuse began months before Delilah's death. According to testimony, Peña created an environment of control, fear, and punishment. Her older daughters, just 11 and 12 at the time, were either victims or unwilling participants. One was reportedly told to pour scalding water on Delilah as punishment, while Peña was away at work. If they disobeyed, they risked being hurt themselves. On June 25, 2009, something set Peña off. After returning home that night, she reportedly saw Delilah looking at her, an act that was considered forbidden in the household. What followed, according to court testimony, was a brutal escalation. Peña struck her daughter multiple times and eventually confined her in a plastic storage bin, her wrists and ankles bound a sock placed in her mouth. Then Peña left the house. Hours later, Delilah was found unresponsive. Paramedics arrived, but it was too late. She had died of blunt force trauma to the head. The child also had second-degree burns on over 30% of her body, multiple bruises and cuts, and partial amputations of her fingers. It was clear this had not been a single event. It was the horrifying conclusion of prolonged torture. 5 days later, Peña was arrested. Her surviving daughters provided statements that painted a chilling picture of life inside the home. One admitted she had been forced to hurt her sister out of fear. The other, who hadn't been abused, was told she would suffer if she didn't report the other's misbehavior. In June 2013, Yolanda Peña was convicted of first-degree murder torture and multiple counts of child abuse. The trial lasted 3 days, and jurors heard emotional testimony from Peña's own children. The judge called it the worst crime he had seen in 17 years on the bench. Peña received 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. Psychological experts never formally assessed her motives, but the prosecution argued that resentment, unresolved anger, and a fractured sense of control all contributed to her actions. There was no official diagnosis, only a trail of pain. One of Peña's daughters later told the court, "I forgive you, but I will never forget." Her words linger because sometimes the deepest scars are carried by the ones who survive. 19. Blair STOCKDILL. Blair STOCKDILL was just 25 years old when she committed an act that would devastate a family and shake an entire community. On September 15, 2010, inside her quiet apartment in Ventura, California, she drowned her 8-year-old daughter, Elena. 5 days later, police discovered the child's body lifeless, yet carefully placed on a satin pillow in the bathtub, as if in mourning or prayer. What investigators would uncover was not only a tragic death, but a portrait of a mother lost to mental illness. Blair had struggled with bipolar disorder since her teenage years. At 17, she was hospitalized after experiencing psychotic episodes. She claimed at the time she was trying to protect her infant daughter from what she believed were evil spirits. Her father, Michael Stockdill, took custody of Elena in 2005, concerned for the child's safety. But after years of relative stability, Blair petitioned to regain full custody, and in December 2009, she succeeded. Outwardly, there were signs of hope. Blair was a single mother trying to rebuild her life. But beneath that facade, her mental health was unraveling again. In the weeks leading up to Elena's death, neighbors reported strange behavior. Child Protective Services visited the home after a complaint that Blair had choked her daughter. But both police and social workers found no evidence of abuse. The case was closed just 12 days before Elena died. Prosecutors later revealed that Blair believed demons were trying to harm her through her cats and her daughter. In her psychosis, she saw Elena not as a child in need of protection, but as a conduit for danger. On the day of the crime, Blair reportedly attempted to cleanse or protect her daughter, an act driven by delusion rather than cruelty. After the drowning, she placed Elena's body gently in the bathtub, covered her with towels, and ran warm water in the hopes she might revive her. The body was discovered on September 20th by Blair's former boyfriend, who forced his way into the apartment after becoming concerned. Elena had been dead for several days. Blair, disoriented and emotionally detached, was arrested shortly after. She eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder by reason of insanity. At trial, prosecutors made a rare concession. They agreed that Blair was legally insane at the time of the crime. The mental health records spanning nearly a decade painted a clear picture. According to court-appointed psychiatrists, Blair had suffered a complete psychotic break. The court sentenced her to 25 years to life in a locked state mental hospital. There were no victim impact statements, and Blair chose not to speak at sentencing. Her attorney, however, told the court that not a day went by without Blair thinking of her daughter. Prosecutor Christina Jensen echoed the emotional toll, saying, "I can't imagine what Blair Stockdill goes through thinking about what happened to her child." This wasn't a story of calculated malice. It was a tragedy of untreated illness, failed intervention, and irreversible loss. Elena was described as a vibrant little girl who loved art and school. She never got the chance to grow up. And the question still lingers, could more have been done to save her? 20. Ka Yang. Ka Yang was 30 years old when her life and the lives of those around her were permanently shattered. On March 17, 2011, inside her Sacramento home, Yang's 7-week-old daughter, Mirabel Taulo, lost her life in one of the most disturbing child death cases ever seen in the region. What followed was a years-long investigation into a mother's mental state, medical history, and the unbearable line between illness and accountability. Ka Yang was a mother of 4 and lived with her husband and children in a quiet residential neighborhood. She had no criminal history and was described by friends and family as a gentle woman. Born in 1981 and part of the Hmong American community, Yang was employed at an architectural firm and reportedly trying to balance work and home life. Outwardly, nothing suggested what would later unfold behind closed doors, but Yang had struggled with epilepsy since her early teens, experiencing frequent seizures that left her confused and disoriented. Her condition, she claimed, often made her feel detached from reality, a medical history that would later play a central role in her legal defense. Still, those closest to her had never observed behavior that seemed dangerous, nor any previous incidents of violence toward her children. On the day Mirabel died, Ka Yang was reportedly alone with her infant for just 11 minutes. That brief window was all it took. Initially, Yang told investigators she had blacked out while holding Mirabel near a space heater and awoke to find her injured. But something didn't add up. There were no signs of burns from a heater, and more importantly, no signs of clothing or hair damage typically caused by fire. Investigators soon found the baby's pacifier inside the microwave. When confronted, Yang changed her story. She suggested she might suffer from a split personality, though this had never been diagnosed. Eventually, she admitted to putting her daughter in the microwave and turning it on. At trial, the prosecution argued that the act was deliberate and not the result of a seizure. Forensic evidence showed Mirabel had suffered internal thermal injuries consistent with microwave exposure, including damage to her stomach and intestines, while her clothing remained untouched. The medical examiner stated these injuries could not have been caused by a heater or other surface burn. Prosecutors said Yang had grown frustrated with her fussy infant and viewed her as a distraction from work. Yang's defense maintained she was in a post-seizure state of confusion and unaware of her actions. But after 3 weeks of testimony and just 1 day of deliberation, a jury found her guilty of first-degree murder and assault on a child causing great bodily injury. In December 2015, she was sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. There was no prior history of abuse, no violent outbursts, just a sudden tragic unraveling. Yang's 3 surviving children were placed with relatives, and her family spoke of a woman who, in their eyes, had simply snapped under the weight of her condition. In the end, the case raised haunting questions about mental illness, maternal responsibility, and the fragility of life. As one family member quietly said after the verdict, her mind was out of reality. But for little Mirabel, reality came much too soon and ended far too early. 21. Judias Ana Buenoano. Judias Judy Buenoano was 54 years old when she was arrested for a string of murders that would ultimately place her in the electric chair, making her the first woman executed in Florida in nearly 150 years. Known publicly as the Black Widow, Judy had once been seen as a hard-working single mother and small business owner. She ran a beauty salon in Pensacola, appeared devoted to her children, and presented herself as a devout Catholic. But behind that mask was a calculated killer whose deadly pattern went undetected for over a decade. Born Judias Welty in 1943 in rural Texas, Judy's early life was filled with trauma. Her mother died when she was just 2 years old, and Judy was passed between relatives and foster homes. Her father remarried, but the home she returned to in New Mexico was reportedly abusive. She suffered beatings, was burned with cigarettes, and treated like a servant. At age 14, Judy snapped, attacking her family in a violent outburst. She was sent to jail, then reform school, where she graduated and tried to build a new life. But the pain of her childhood seemed to shape her deeply. She grew up distrusting, fiercely independent, and as some would later say, emotionally detached. After working as a nurse's aide, she married Air Force Sergeant James Goodyear in 1962. They raised 3 children and moved to Florida. Outwardly, it seemed a stable life. But just 3 months after James returned from his Vietnam tour in 1971, he died suddenly of unexplained symptoms. At the time, no one questioned it. Judy quietly collected his life insurance and moved on. The pattern repeated. In 1978, her boyfriend Bobby Joe Morris died under similar mysterious conditions in Colorado. And then in 1980, her 19-year-old son Michael, who had become paralyzed from a rare illness, drowned during a family canoe trip. He was wearing heavy metal braces on his legs, and without a life jacket, he had no chance. Judy claimed it was an accident. Investigators accepted her story at first. But in 1983, things began to unravel. Her then-fiancé, John Gentry, was seriously injured when a bomb exploded in his car. Judy had told him she was pregnant, and they were celebrating. But Gentry later revealed that Judy had been giving him vitamins that made him violently ill. Police found traces of arsenic and formaldehyde in those capsules. She wasn't pregnant. She had secretly taken out a life insurance policy on him, and she had already booked a cruise for herself and her children without him. Investigators began to dig. Exhumations of James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris showed they had both died from chronic arsenic poisoning. Michael's body contained arsenic too. Though never proven, some suspected she had been poisoning her son gradually before his drowning, possibly to increase his insurance payout. Judy was convicted in 3 separate trials: life imprisonment for Michael's murder, 12 years, for the attempted murder of Gentry, and a death sentence for the killing of her husband. She never confessed and never expressed remorse. For 13 years on death row, she crocheted blankets, read the Bible, and insisted she was innocent. Psychologists and prosecutors agreed that her motive was financial insurance money amounting to over $240,000. But many believe something deeper was at play, a pattern of control deception, and perhaps a twisted attempt at empowerment rooted in early trauma. On March 30, 1998, Judy Buenoano was executed in Florida's electric chair. She made no final statement. That day would have been her son Michael's 37th birthday. As Pensacola prosecutor Russell Edgar said, "She fed off her mates and her young." The chilling question remains, how many more lives might she have taken had the bomb not failed? 22. Molly Midyett. Molly Midyett was 27 years old when she was arrested in connection with the death of her 10-week-old son, Jason. At the time, she lived in Louisville, Colorado, and was known as a quiet, educated woman, a law school graduate who appeared to be starting a new chapter in life as a wife and mother. Friends described her as intelligent and soft-spoken. To the outside world, there was no visible sign of the tragedy unfolding inside her home. Molly had married Alex Midyett, a man from a prominent local family, and the couple seemed poised for a comfortable life. But behind closed doors, the dynamic was very different. In later court filings, Molly would allege that Alex and his father exerted control over her emotionally, financially, and psychologically. She claimed she was pressured into silence, manipulated to protect her husband, and even threatened with the loss of her son's ashes if she spoke out. Whether or not those claims were true remains a point of legal and public debate. The horror began in February 2006 when baby Jason was taken to the Children's Hospital in Denver. He had a fractured skull, a broken clavicle, and more than 20 other bone fractures. Doctors immediately suspected abuse. Despite the severity of his injuries, there had been no emergency call, no rush to get him help. Molly later testified that Jason seemed sick, but not seriously so. When his condition worsened, instead of going to the nearest emergency room, she waited for a scheduled appointment with their family doctor, more than 2 hours away. By the time Jason was finally brought to the hospital, it was too late. He died shortly after being admitted. Both parents insisted there had to be a medical explanation. They denied knowing how their son had been injured. But the evidence told another story. A jury later concluded that while Alex may have caused the injuries, Molly had failed to protect Jason or seek help in time. Prosecutors argued that she ignored clear signs of trauma. Molly's defense maintained she was unaware of the abuse and in denial about her son's worsening condition. In 2007, Molly Midyett was convicted of child abuse resulting in death and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Alex Midyett faced a separate trial and received the same sentence. During her trial, Molly sat mostly expressionless, but when the verdict was read, she broke down, mouthing the words, "My life is over." Her husband shouted at the court, denying her guilt. The courtroom descended into chaos. Years later, Molly sought a new trial, claiming she was the victim of emotional abuse and legal misguidance, that she had been silenced by her husband's family and manipulated into protecting Alex. But the judge ruled that she had been mentally competent, actively involved in her defense, and ultimately responsible for her inaction. Psychologists did not find sufficient evidence of battered woman syndrome or post-traumatic stress, though the debate over her psychological state continues. Some see her as a passive participant in a tragedy she failed to prevent. Others believe she was another victim, frozen by fear and loyalty. In the end, the case raises an agonizing question. When silence costs a life, is it neglect or survival? For Molly Midyett, the answer was 16 years behind bars and a lifetime marked by the death of her only child. 23. Kelly Lynn Murphy. Kelly Lynn Murphy was 41 years old when she was arrested on a spring morning in Castle Rock, Colorado. Just hours earlier, she had placed a quiet but chilling call to 911. She reported that she had tried to take her own life. When the dispatcher asked about her children, she responded, "They're in heaven now." That single line would mark the beginning of one of the most devastating family tragedies in the town's history. By all outward appearances, Kelly was a devoted stay-at-home mom. She had 2 children, Liam 9 and Madigan 6, both enrolled in elementary school. Friends described her as soft-spoken, attentive, and fiercely protective of her kids. But behind the walls of their suburban home, her world was unraveling. She and her husband, Robert Eric Murphy, were in the middle of a bitter divorce. The couple had filed restraining orders, accused each other of abuse, and battled over custody. Kelly wanted sole custody. Robert was fighting for joint rights, and the next day, they were due in court to finalize temporary orders. In the months leading up to the murders, court documents revealed a toxic family dynamic. Kelly had accused her husband of choking their daughter and pushing her head underwater. She said he once barricaded her in the basement. But Robert denied the claims. Regardless of who was telling the truth, Kelly's mental health was visibly deteriorating. She appeared isolated, overwhelmed, and increasingly erratic. On May 23, 2011, Kelly smothered her 2 children in their beds. There were no signs of a struggle, just 2 silent rooms, perfectly made beds, and a mother in the next room, with self-inflicted wounds to her wrists. She had consumed alcohol and pain medication in an apparent suicide attempt. When first responders arrived, she was calm but evasive. She asked for a lawyer. She repeated that her children were in heaven. Police later found a court custody document on the kitchen table with the handwritten words. Was it worth it? Prosecutors said it was a message to her husband. The trial began in 2012. Kelly's defense team argued that she was in the midst of a mental health crisis, impaired by medication and alcohol, and not fully aware of her actions. They claimed she had planned only to end her own life and woke up to a nightmare she couldn't explain. But prosecutors countered with a different story. They painted her as controlling and determined to punish her husband by taking away what he loved most. Medical experts testified that smothering 2 children required awareness, intention, and time. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. Kelly Murphy was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. In court, family members wept. Liam would have turned 11 that day. Experts didn't agree on a single motivation. Was it revenge, desperation, or untreated psychological collapse? The prosecution framed it as a need for control. The defense called it an act of mental illness. Either way, the result was irreversible. Mothers give life, one prosecutor told the jury. But in this case, Kelly Murphy took it. And the question that lingers still is one no courtroom can answer. What causes a loving mother to cross that final tragic line? 24. Mayra Perez. On the morning of February 6, 2013, police officers entered a modest home in northeast Denver and found a scene that would haunt them for years. Inside, 23-year-old Mayra Perez and 2 of her children were dead. A third child, just 2 years old, was clinging to life. The violence that had unfolded in the early hours of that day left a family shattered, a community stunned, and a heartbreaking question unanswered: why? Mayra Perez was by all accounts a devoted mother. She had 3 young children, Nevaeh, age 4, Eric, just 1, and Isabel, who was 2. Neighbors often saw them riding bikes, walking their dog, or playing in the front yard. Mayra had recently moved to Denver from Texas with her husband Ricky Perez, hoping to build a better future. Their life appeared stable, even happy. But behind closed doors, the marriage was strained. That night, Mayra and Ricky had an argument, one that, by his account, led him to leave and spend the night at a friend's house. It wasn't their first disagreement, but it would be their last. Sometime in the early hours of February 6th, Mayra retrieved 2 firearms, a handgun and a shotgun, and turned them on her children. She then took her own life. Her daughter Nevaeh and infant son Eric were killed instantly. Her youngest Isabel was found barely alive. She had been shot in the head, yet somehow she survived. When Ricky returned home just before 7 a.m., he found the unthinkable. A quiet house, a blood-stained bedroom, his children's bodies. Police quickly ruled out outside involvement. There were no signs of forced entry, no suspects to chase. Investigators found spent shell casings and firearms still at the scene. Mayra's body lay next to a shotgun. A handgun was discovered nearby. It was murder-suicide, sudden, devastating, and without warning. In the weeks that followed, family and friends struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the one who carried out this act. Relatives described Mayra as nurturing and involved. There had been no formal reports of domestic violence, no known history of mental illness. And yet beneath the surface something had unraveled. Tensions in the marriage had been escalating. Some family members later described Mayra as isolated and overwhelmed, signs that in hindsight seemed like silent distress signals. Against all odds, Isabel Perez survived. Doctors called her recovery a miracle. She emerged from a coma after nearly 2 weeks and began to regain movement and speech. Her journey toward healing, both physical and emotional, would take years. But with the love of her extended family and the care of dedicated medical teams, she would leave the hospital and start a new life with her father. Psychologists never had the chance to fully explore Mayra Perez's state of mind. But in the absence of answers, speculation endures. Was it desperation, mental illness, a moment of crisis that spiraled too far, too fast? Perhaps the most haunting aspect is that we may never know. In the end, one chilling fact remains: a mother made a choice that silenced her children's futures and left a permanent echo of sorrow. And for those left behind, the only path forward is through memory, resilience, and the hope that Isabel's survival might someday bring light to a story born in darkness. 25. Amy S. Grossberg. Amy Grossberg was 18 years old in November 1996, an art-loving freshman at the University of Delaware. She came from the affluent town of Wyckoff, New Jersey, where she'd grown up in comfort, attending Ramapo High School, alongside her boyfriend, Brian Peterson. Their relationship was typical of high school sweethearts: yearbook photos, prom nights, and college plans. But behind the polished surface, a secret had taken root, one that would end in tragedy. Amy had hidden her pregnancy from nearly everyone, including her parents. She wore baggy clothes, distanced herself, and enrolled in college without revealing the truth. By all appearances, she was a normal student, making a quiet transition to campus life. Brian, meanwhile, attended college in Pennsylvania. Though the two were now in different states, they stayed in touch, and that connection would soon lead them both into a nightmare. On November 12th, Amy went into labor in her dorm room. In pain and panicking, she called Brian. He drove 3 hours to reach her and took her to a nearby Comfort Inn in Newark, Delaware. They checked into room 220. What happened next has remained partly obscured by conflicting accounts. But one fact is certain: Amy delivered a baby boy in that motel room alone with Brian. The child was alive at birth. According to their statements, the young couple believed the baby was stillborn. They wrapped him in a garbage bag and left him in a motel dumpster. They returned to their colleges, Amy suffering internally, Brian trying to resume normalcy. But that illusion didn't last. A cleaning staff member discovered bloodied sheets and alerted police. Later, when Amy began experiencing seizures caused by medical complications from childbirth, hospital staff quickly realized what had occurred. The police put the pieces together. With the help of K-9 units, they found the infant's body in the dumpster. The autopsy revealed devastating injuries. The baby had been shaken and suffered multiple fractures to the skull, evidence that he was not stillborn. Prosecutors announced charges of first-degree murder and said they would seek the death penalty for both teens. At first, Amy and Brian appeared united, but when legal pressure mounted, they turned on each other. Brian claimed Amy had told him to get rid of it. Amy, in turn, insisted Brian acted alone. Ultimately, both accepted plea deals. Brian pleaded guilty to manslaughter in exchange for testifying against Amy and was sentenced to 2 years. Amy, after hearing the full extent of Brian's claims, also accepted a plea and received 2.5 years in prison. The case shocked the nation, not just for its emotional weight, but because the perpetrators didn't fit the expected narrative. These weren't troubled teens from unstable homes. They were privileged, educated, and surrounded by options they didn't take. Psychologists and journalists speculated on the motivations: fear of shame, emotional immaturity, pressure to uphold a perfect image. There was no history of mental illness, no criminal records, just a terrible decision made under extraordinary pressure and secrecy. Amy was released early in 2000 for good behavior and program participation. She returned home quietly, avoided media attention, and later helped launch a family business. Brian moved to Florida and started a new life. The baby was never named. In the end, the story of Amy Grossberg is not just one of crime but of the high cost of silence. It asks a painful question. What happens when fear overrides love and secrecy replaces truth, and could one honest conversation, just one, have changed everything? 26. Eryn ALLEGRA. On Christmas Day in 2008, a quiet room in a Holiday Inn in Port St. Lucie, Florida, became the scene of a tragic and deeply unsettling crime. Eryn ALLEGRA, a 31-year-old mother and former daycare worker, was found alive, injured, and alone. Her 8-year-old son, Tristan Michael ALLEGRA, was not so fortunate. That morning, Eryn told police she had smothered her only child while he slept because, in her words, she couldn't bear to leave him behind. Eryn had no previous criminal record. Those who knew her described her as reserved, polite, and protective of her son. She had once worked at a daycare center, and from the outside seemed to be a devoted mother. But in the years leading up to Christmas 2008, Eryn's life began to slowly fall apart. She lost her job, struggled to keep stable housing, and experienced a miscarriage after an affair ended. Her marriage to Michael ALLEGRA had crumbled, though they were still legally bound. Custody was shared, and there was no record of custody disputes or abuse. In the months before the murder, Eryn's writings and statements painted a picture of a woman spiraling into despair. In her journal, she wrote, "I am just alone. Nowhere else to go. People move on. I just can't." Financial difficulties, personal losses, and deep emotional isolation seemed to weigh heavily on her. By December, she had made up her mind. On the night of December 24th, Eryn took Tristan to a local Holiday Inn. They ate dinner, watched cartoons, and talked. At some point, she gave him 8 Advil pills to make him sleepy. In the early morning hours of Christmas Day, while he slept peacefully, she placed a pillow over his face. After he stopped breathing, she attempted suicide by slitting her wrists in the hotel bathroom. When that failed, she called 911. The responding officers found a note addressed to Tristan. "You'll always be my sweet boy," it read. Eryn confessed almost immediately. In her statement to police, she said she killed her son rather than leave him in the custody of his father. There was no attempt to deny her actions. When asked whether she thought she was insane, she responded calmly, "No. I knew what I was doing, and I did it." Prosecutors initially considered the death penalty. But in February 2010, Eryn pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse, avoiding a capital sentence. She was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 30 years to be served consecutively. During the sentencing, Tristan's paternal grandmother addressed Eryn directly. Her words were full of heartbreak. "If you had committed suicide, it would have been hard enough on us. But we would still have Tristan." Eryn showed no visible emotion in court, answering the judge's questions in a soft voice. She offered no explanation beyond what she had already given. Psychologists were not publicly involved in her defense, but her writings and behavior suggest profound emotional despair, perhaps compounded by untreated depression or trauma. Whether her actions were rooted in fear, grief, or control remains unanswered. Eryn ALLEGRA now serves her sentence in a Florida prison. Her son, once described as talkative, thoughtful, and kind, is remembered by his father as his best friend. And in the end, a mother's final decision leaves us with an impossible question. How can love and loss exist in the same breath and lead to something so irreversible? 27. Jennifer Berman. On the morning of January 13, 2014, police in West Palm Beach, Florida, responded to a chilling call. Inside a historic home on Pershing Way, they found the bodies of Jennifer Berman and her two teenage children, 16-year-old Alexander and 15-year-old Jacqueline. All three had died from gunshot wounds. What unfolded was a tragic case of a mother pushed to the brink by grief, debt, and despair. Jennifer Berman had once been a realtor living comfortably in South Florida with her husband Richard and their two bright, musically gifted children. But behind the elegant exterior, life was unraveling. Jennifer and Richard had endured a long and bitter marital separation that began years earlier. By December 2013, their divorce was finalized, just a few months before Jennifer's mother passed away. The family home previously owned by her mother was in foreclosure, and Jennifer, now on her own financially, had taken a job as a night nurse to support her kids. Her son Alexander played cello. Her daughter Jacqueline was a violinist and straight-A student. They both attended the prestigious Alexander W. Dreyfus School of the Arts. In their world, they were admired, focused, and full of promise. But their mother behind closed doors was quietly breaking. According to court documents, Jennifer struggled to keep up. She had resorted to pawning her late father's watch to pay for gas and groceries. She had lost her attorney because she couldn't afford legal fees. She claimed in filings that her ex-husband had stopped contributing to household expenses, even basic items like food or toilet paper. Friends later described her as withdrawn and visibly distressed in the days leading up to the tragedy. On that January morning, Richard Berman received a disturbing email from his ex-wife. She wrote that she had done the best thing for their family. She also sent a text to her cousin, stating her intention to kill the children and herself. Richard called 911 while rushing to the house. When he and a neighbor arrived, the scene was unthinkable. Police soon confirmed the murder-suicide. Jennifer had shot her two children, likely while they were still sleeping, before turning the gun on herself. No suicide note was released, but the digital messages and legal history revealed a mother overwhelmed by circumstances she believed she could no longer change. The community was devastated. At Dreyfus School of the Arts, grief counselors were brought in to help classmates cope. Tributes poured in for the two teens who were remembered not only for their talents, but for their kindness and spirit. Jennifer's motive remains both painfully clear and deeply incomprehensible. Financial ruin, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of hopelessness likely created a psychological crisis. Friends noticed a shift in her demeanor, something hollow, something missing, but no one could have predicted what she was planning. She didn't leave a final speech, only actions that speak louder than words. What remains are echoes of music never played, milestones never reached, and a family destroyed not by violence alone, but by silence, by isolation, and by one irreversible choice. In the face of such loss, we're left to ask how many warning signs go unnoticed before someone makes a decision no one can take back. 28. Clover Boykin. In 1994, 19-year-old Clover Boykin sat quietly in a courtroom in Palm Beach County, Florida. She was charged with the unthinkable, the murders of two infants, her own 5-month-old son Dayton, and a 9-month-old baby named Kayla Basante, whom she had once lovingly babysat. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of betrayal and grief hung heavily in the air. Clover's life had not followed a stable path. Born in January 1975, she was passed between relatives throughout her childhood after her father left the family when she was just 7. Raised between her mother, grandmother, and an aunt and uncle, Clover grew up without a consistent parental presence. Friends and acquaintances described her as quiet and reserved, never the type to cause trouble. She had worked at a local grocery store, later securing a job as a file clerk at a doctor's office. Outwardly, she appeared responsible and composed. But inside Clover was a storm no one saw coming. On November 16, 1993, 9-month-old Kayla Basante was found unresponsive while in Clover's care. The child was hospitalized and placed on life support, but died several days later. Her death was initially ruled accidental. For nearly a year, Clover remained in the Basante family's lives, offering comfort, attending gatherings, and sharing in their grief. But behind her calm expression was a secret no one suspected. Almost a year later, tragedy struck again. On October 27, 1994, Clover's infant son, Dayton, was found dead in her bedroom. She told her family it was sudden infant death syndrome, but an autopsy revealed injuries inconsistent with that explanation. When detectives brought her in for questioning, Clover made a startling confession. Not only had she killed Dayton, but she had also been responsible for Kayla's death the year before. According to her own words, Clover had been struggling emotionally. She described haunting dreams, childhood trauma, and a desperate need for attention. She said that during a nightmare she mistook her son for her abusive father and acted violently. In the case of Kayla, she admitted to lashing out in a moment of rage after feeling emotionally abandoned by her then-boyfriend. She told investigators, "I'm evil. I thank Detective Olson for stopping me, or I would have gone on hurting someone else." The legal outcome was swift and severe. Clover Boykin pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Kayla's death and second-degree murder in Dayton's. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years before parole eligibility, plus 40 years served concurrently. The Basante family expressed outrage that parole was even an option. Psychological experts and defense attorneys pointed to Clover's troubled upbringing and unresolved trauma. But to the families of the victims, those explanations felt hollow. To them, she wasn't broken, she was calculated. She mourned with them while hiding a horrifying truth. Today, Clover lives in protective custody, isolated from other inmates. In prison, as in life, baby killers are reviled, even among the guilty. She once said no one paid attention to her. Now no one wants to. And in that silence, maybe Clover Boykin finally hears the echoes of the lives she ended 2 children, whose voices were silenced far too soon. 29. Ana Maria Cardona. In November 1990, a small boy's body was discovered beneath a hedge in a quiet Miami Beach neighborhood. He was emaciated, bruised, and unidentified. Wearing a white t-shirt decorated with colorful lollipops, he became known only as Baby Lollipops. For weeks, no one knew his name until a police investigation led to his mother, Ana Maria Cardona. Ana Cardona was 30 years old at the time of her arrest. A Cuban immigrant living in Miami, she had once lived a life of comfort funded by her late boyfriend, a wealthy drug dealer. But when he was murdered, Cardona inherited his assets and quickly squandered them. Within months, she was broke, jobless, and addicted to crack cocaine. She shared a small efficiency apartment with her children and her partner, Olivia Gonzalez. Cardona was a mother of 3, but her youngest 3-year-old, Lazaro Figueroa, soon became the focus of devastating allegations. Witnesses would later describe Lazaro's visible suffering. Neighbors rarely saw the boy, and when they did, he looked withdrawn and malnourished. Cardona blamed Lazaro for her downfall, seeing him not as a child, but as a reminder of everything she had lost. Her emotional unraveling became increasingly apparent. According to prosecutors, Cardona began taking out her anger on Lazaro. He was reportedly locked in closets, tied up, and denied food for long stretches. Meanwhile, Cardona and Gonzalez fed their drug habits through theft and avoided employment. In her taped confession, Cardona would later claim that her drug use dulled her ability to stop what was happening or to help her son. On October 31, 1990, Lazzaro was fatally beaten allegedly with a baseball bat. His body was dumped near a Miami Beach mansion left to be found by strangers. When police launched their investigation, they tracked Cardona and Gonzalez to Central Florida, where they had fled. Both women were arrested. Cardona claimed the child died after falling off a bed. Gonzalez, however, testified that Cardona delivered the fatal blow and had abused the child for months. In 1992, Ana Cardona was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, becoming the first woman in Florida to receive that sentence for killing her own child. But in 2002, the Florida Supreme Court overturned the conviction, citing withheld evidence that could have undermined Gonzalez's credibility. Cardona was retried and in 2010 found guilty again. The jury recommended death once more, and in 2011 the judge reinstated her sentence. Psychological assessments described Cardona as emotionally damaged, shaped by an abusive childhood and years of trauma. Her defense portrayed her as a woman overwhelmed by poverty, addiction, and toxic relationships. But the prosecution emphasized that Lazzaro's suffering was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was prolonged, systematic, and deliberate. Even years later, the case still echoes through Miami's collective memory. This is child torture. One medical examiner said, describing Lazzaro's condition at the time of death. The boy had spent nearly every day of his short life in pain. When Judge Rey Humberto Diaz handed down the sentence, he spoke directly to Cardona. "You have forfeited your right to live." The question that haunts the public remains. How does a mother become the architect of her child's torment? And more chillingly, how many others suffered in silence just beyond the headlines? 30. Carol Carr. On a quiet afternoon in June 2002, at a nursing home in Griffin, Georgia, 63-year-old Carol Carr walked into the room where her two adult sons lay bedridden. Moments later, both men were dead. She had shot them each once in the head with a .25 caliber handgun. Then, without resistance, she walked to the lobby and waited for police. Carol wasn't a career criminal or a stranger to her victims. In fact, she was their mother. And for much of her adult life, she had been their caretaker, their advocate, and their only consistent source of comfort. Carol Carr was a widow and a retired telephone company worker. Her life changed dramatically after her husband, Hoyt Scott, was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, a rare and devastating genetic disorder that slowly destroys a person's motor skills, mental functions, and personality. He suffered for over 2 decades before dying in 1995. But Hoyt wasn't the only one. The disease had already devastated his family, taking his mother, sister, and brother. By the mid-1990s, 2 of Carol's sons, Randy and Andy, were also diagnosed. One by one, they followed the same painful decline as their father, losing the ability to walk, speak, or even feed themselves. Carol tried to care for them at home for as long as she could. But when their needs exceeded her ability, she made the difficult decision to place them in a nursing facility. Even then, she visited regularly, changed their linens, and tended to their basic needs. Despite their deteriorating conditions, Carol stayed present until one day she broke. On June 8, 2002, Carol walked into the Sunbridge Care Facility where her sons shared a room. Both were in the advanced stages of the disease, unable to communicate, suffering from bed sores, and increasingly withdrawn. Within moments, both men were gone. When police arrived, Carol told them simply, "I didn't want them to suffer anymore." Her surviving son, James Scott, who also has Huntington's, later defended his mother. She gave it her all, he said. They weren't living anymore. They were just existing. The legal system responded cautiously. Carol was charged with 2 counts of murder, but in 2003 she pleaded guilty to assisted suicide, a little-used law in Georgia. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and was released on parole after serving 21 months. One condition: if James were to reach advanced stages of the disease, she would be legally barred from being his caregiver. Public opinion was deeply divided. Many sympathized with her situation, calling the case one of tragic mercy. Others questioned where the line is drawn between compassion and crime. Legal experts, ethicists, and physicians all weighed in, but the question remains complex. Carol Carr never denied what she did. She claimed no insanity, no confusion, only a mother's final act of love for 2 sons who had already lost everything. And while the law passed judgment, the heart of the case is harder to resolve. When does mercy become murder? And who decides when suffering has gone on long enough? 31. Cassidy Goodson. In the fall of 2012, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Lakeland, Florida, was rocked by a case that left even seasoned investigators stunned. 14-year-old Cassidy Goodson, a high school freshman with no criminal history, stood accused of a crime few could comprehend, taking the life of her newborn son just moments after delivering him alone in a bathroom at home. Cassidy was known as a polite, soft-spoken teen. She played softball, helped around the house, and regularly attended church with her family. Her room was filled with trophies, family photos, and signs of a typical adolescence. But beneath the surface, Cassidy was hiding a secret pregnancy, a secret that would end in tragedy. According to investigators, Cassidy concealed her condition for months. She wore baggy clothes and even showed her mother fake pregnancy tests to avoid detection. Though family members had suspicions, Cassidy insisted nothing was wrong. She later told detectives she feared disappointing her parents and believed the consequences of telling them the truth would be worse than anything else. On September 19, 2012, Cassidy went into labor in the bathroom of her family's mobile home. With no assistance, she delivered a full-term 9.5-pound baby boy. Evidence later showed the baby was born alive. Cassidy later admitted she panicked. Afraid, overwhelmed, and desperate, she placed her hands around the infant's neck and applied pressure until, in her words, he stopped moving. She then cleaned herself, and the newborn wrapped the body in a towel and hid it in a shoebox beneath dirty clothes in her bedroom. 3 days passed before the secret unraveled. Cassidy's mother, Theresa, noticed a foul smell while gathering laundry and found the shoebox. Inside, she discovered the baby's remains and called police. Cassidy at first claimed she had miscarried, but soon after she confessed during a police interview, calmly reenacting the incident with a doll. Her chilling explanation: "I wanted it to stop breathing so I wouldn't get in trouble." Initially charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse, Cassidy faced the possibility of life in prison. But the facts of the case painted a complicated picture. There was no history of violence, no sign of malicious intent, only panic and profound immaturity. In court, the prosecution, defense, and judge agreed that though a life had been lost, throwing away another would serve no purpose. On December 19, 2012, Cassidy pleaded guilty to manslaughter. She was sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile maximum security facility, followed by supervised probation. If she violates the terms of her release, she could still face up to 15 years in adult prison. Experts and family members described Cassidy as a child in crisis, not a hardened criminal. Her lawyer, Howardine Garrett, said it best: "Everybody cared about a young girl who had never been in any trouble, and no one wanted to throw that potential away." Still, the question lingers: how did a frightened teenager reach such a breaking point in complete silence? It is a case that forces us to look not only at crime, but at fear, shame, and the cost of secrets too heavy for a child to carry alone. 32. Tivasha Logan. Tivasha Logan was 25 years old when she was arrested in Lakeland, Florida, the day after her infant daughter, Chontasia Gardner, was found lifeless in their home. A mother of 6, Logan lived with her partner, Chauncey Gardner, and their children in a small home on Sunshine Drive. Despite the appearance of a full household, stocked pantry, active family life behind closed doors, tragedy had been unfolding for months. Logan was no stranger to hardship. Records showed a history of low-income reliance on public assistance and limited educational attainment. Her defense would later claim she had an intellectual disability functioning at a 4th-grade reading level and struggled with basic comprehension. Still, she was raising 5 other children, juggling daily demands, and appeared to most observers as a mother doing her best under pressure. But what happened to Chontasia was not just neglect, it was a slow decline into starvation. Born prematurely in May 2009, Chontasia left the hospital, weighing just over 7 pounds. By the time of her death 5 months later, she weighed 6. Prosecutors said Logan and Gardner had been feeding her severely diluted formula, using only 1/3 of the recommended amount over weeks, possibly months. The baby's body bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged malnutrition: sunken eyes, visible ribs, and dry, wrinkled skin. Logan told detectives she noticed her daughter was losing weight, but chose not to seek medical care. She was afraid, she admitted, that taking Chontasia to the hospital would trigger child welfare authorities and risk losing custody of her other children. So she waited, deciding to hold off until a scheduled doctor's appointment on November 2nd. But Chontasia died the morning before. When first responders arrived, they found the baby unresponsive. The refrigerator was full, food lined the shelves. But for Chontasia, there was only 1 partial can of formula, and not nearly enough nourishment. During her trial in 2012, Logan wept silently in court as jurors found her guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter of a child. Under Florida law, those convictions meant a mandatory sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The judge had no discretion. The defense argued for compassion, pointing to her limited mental capacity and poor judgment. But the jury found that her failure to act, knowing her child was wasting away, amounted to aggravated child abuse. Prosecutors described her actions as a fatal blend of recklessness and avoidance. They pointed to lies she told family members about Chontasia's weight and health. And while her attorney maintained she loved her daughter and never intended harm, the law found otherwise. Tivasha Logan never offered a statement to the court. Her silence that day mirrored the silence that surrounded Chontasia's suffering. In the end, the court saw not just a mistake, but a preventable tragedy. And perhaps the most haunting part of this case is that help food formula, even medical care, was within reach. But fear and inaction sealed the fate of a child who could not speak for herself. 33. Chelsea Huggett. In the quiet community of Citrus County, Florida, the name Chelsea Huggett would soon become synonymous with a story of failure, heartbreak, and irreversible loss. At just 23 years old, Huggett pleaded guilty to the unthinkable, the death of her own 2-year-old daughter, Aaliyah Marie Branham. Before her arrest in April 2013, Chelsea was a young mother with another child on the way. Outwardly, her life showed signs of strain, unemployment, unstable housing, and past military service complicated by reported mental health challenges. Family and neighbors noticed volatility in her behavior, but no one could have predicted how devastating the outcome would be. Aaliyah had been born with developmental disabilities. Her short life was marked by physical challenges and a need for consistent medical care. But instead of receiving the support she needed, she was trapped in a cycle of neglect and abuse. Reports indicate that Huggett struggled with anger management, often lashing out at her daughter over seemingly minor behaviors, especially when the toddler cried or climbed on her. The warning signs were not hidden. The Department of Children and Families had visited the home twice in the year before Aaliyah's death. Witnesses, including family members and medical professionals, raised concerns about bruising, unsanitary conditions, and Chelsea's treatment of her daughter. There were even allegations that she had tried to smother Aaliyah in public. Still, no protective action was taken, and Aaliyah remained in her mother's care. On April 26, 2013, that failure came to a head. In the early morning hours, Chelsea shook her daughter violently and struck her head against a wall. Acts of rage triggered, she later said, by the child's constant crying. By the time authorities arrived, Aaliyah was unconscious. She was pronounced dead shortly after being taken to the hospital. The medical examiner confirmed blunt force trauma to the head. Her tiny body showed widespread bruising on her face, shoulders, legs, and back. These weren't injuries from a single moment. They told the story of ongoing harm and a child who had suffered silently for far too long. When questioned by detectives, Huggett initially blamed her boyfriend, claiming he had harmed the child. But the story quickly unraveled. Ultimately, she confessed, saying her daughter's need for affection, her whining, and her disabilities overwhelmed her. It was a chilling admission of frustration turned deadly. In court, Huggett sat silently as prosecutors described the extent of the abuse. Her own family, including her mother and sister, pleaded for the maximum penalty. "It takes a soulless person to harm a child," her sister said through tears. The judge agreed, sentencing Chelsea Huggett to 30 years in prison, the maximum allowed under her plea deal for second-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. A psychological evaluation was never publicly disclosed, but many pointed to untreated trauma, possible post-traumatic stress, and emotional instability as contributing factors. Still, experts agreed nothing justified what happened. In the end, Aaliyah's short life was marked not just by abuse but by systemic failure. The services meant to protect her faltered. Her mother, who had her name and birthday tattooed across her chest, became the source of her greatest danger. And so the question remains, how many signs must be missed before someone listens to a child who cannot speak? 34. Misty Stoddard. Misty Stoddard was 35 years old when she was arrested in connection to the death of her 11-year-old stepdaughter, Melissa Stoddard. At the time, she lived with her partner, Melissa's biological father, in a quiet, rural part of Sarasota County, Florida. Outwardly, Misty appeared to be a mother trying to care for a large blended family, including a newborn baby. But what happened behind closed doors would expose a darker, more disturbing truth. Melissa was a special needs child, diagnosed with autism and bipolar disorder. She had recently moved from North Carolina to Florida in the summer of 2012 after troubling events in her mother's home. Melissa's brother had reportedly behaved inappropriately toward another child, and her mother, fearing for Melissa's safety, sent her to live with her father and stepmother. Tragically, the new environment offered no real protection. In the months leading up to Melissa's death, warning signs were evident. Teachers noticed strange injuries. Melissa missed weeks of school. One staff member even attempted to file an anonymous report with Child Protective Services, but the submission was never completed. A social worker made an unannounced visit, but Misty spoke to her on the porch, refusing to allow her inside. The opportunity to intervene was lost. On December 17, 2012, Melissa died after being rushed to the hospital brain dead from a lack of oxygen. Investigators soon discovered a deeply troubling pattern of treatment. Melissa had been tied nightly to a wooden board described by prosecutors as a homemade restraint device with her mouth duct-taped shut. Testimony revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. A former cellmate of Misty's testified that she admitted to taping Melissa the night she stopped breathing. Even Misty's teenage son told the court he had witnessed both Misty and Kenneth Stoddard tie Melissa to the board. The prosecution presented the case as felony murder. Melissa died during the commission of aggravated child abuse. Though Misty attempted to shift blame to her partner, claiming he was controlling, and that the board had been used on her for disturbing purposes, jurors found her responsible. The court heard from medical experts who testified that Melissa's injuries were consistent with repeated restraint and gagging, and the video played during the trial showing Melissa crying alone outside on the porch, while others played inside painted a picture of emotional abandonment. In June 2014, Misty Stoddard was convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. By Florida law, the murder conviction carried a mandatory life sentence without parole. The judge added an additional 30 years for the abuse charge. Misty showed little emotion at sentencing, offering a brief statement. "I loved Melissa. I still love Melissa. I take full responsibility for the actions and inactions that led up to this event." Psychologists who reviewed Misty's background cited depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but the jury did not find those factors mitigating. Prosecutors argued that parenting a child with special needs is difficult, but it never justifies cruelty. Melissa's story was marked by a series of missed chances and unheard cries. The board she was tied to stood throughout the trial, a silent witness to what happened. In the end, it wasn't just Melissa's voice that was silenced. It was the system, the neighbors, and the adults who should have protected her. Her final words may never be known, but her absence speaks volumes. 35. Alexandra Tobias. Alexandra Tobias was just 22 years old when she was arrested for the murder of her 3-month-old son, Dylan Lee Edmondson, in Jacksonville, Florida. A high school graduate with dreams of college, Tobias had once seemed like a young woman with promise. Those who knew her described her as caring, sometimes mischievous, but loving especially toward her baby boy. But beneath the surface of that image was a young mother struggling with far more than she could manage. Tobias had endured significant trauma. She found her mother dead just 2 years earlier, and later confided in a psychologist that she had been sexually assaulted as a teenager. Her relationship with Dylan's father, Earl Edmondson, was marked by volatility. Both were arrested for domestic violence weeks before the baby's death. Tobias also struggled with undiagnosed or untreated mental health issues and reported taking anti-anxiety medication without a prescription. On January 19, 2010, Tobias was at home playing Farmville, a popular Facebook game. It was supposed to be a mindless escape, a digital distraction. But when Dylan began crying, something inside her snapped. She later admitted to investigators that she shook her son out of frustration. Then she stepped away to smoke a cigarette, attempting to collect herself. But when the baby cried again, she picked him up and shook him once more. Tobias would later suggest that his head may have hit a hard surface during the shaking. Paramedics arrived to find Dylan unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital with head injuries and a broken leg. By the next day, he was pronounced dead. An autopsy confirmed the cause: abusive head trauma. Initially charged with aggravated child abuse, the charge was upgraded to second-degree murder after Dylan's death. During the investigation, Tobias gave inconsistent stories, blaming the injuries on her boyfriend, on her dog, even denying involvement altogether in a letter she wrote from jail. But ultimately, the facts couldn't be ignored. Prosecutors revealed that she called Dylan's father before dialing 911. A recorded phone call from jail revealed her attempt to walk back her earlier confession, but by then the damage had been done both to her son and to her credibility. In February 2011, Alexandra Tobias was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The sentence fell at the high end of her plea deal, which had spared her a trial but not public scrutiny. Her case attracted national media attention, with headlines focusing not on the tragedy itself, but on the seemingly trivial detail that she had been interrupted while playing a Facebook game. But for Dylan's father, the heartbreak wasn't about a screen. It was about a lost child. Psychologists testified that Tobias suffered from postpartum depression compounded by previous trauma and possible bipolar disorder. Still, the court found her responsible. In the judge's words, "He who is the most defenseless among us was murdered by his own mommy." The most haunting part of Alexandra Tobias's story may not be how suddenly it unfolded, but how many red flags were missed along the way. A crying baby, a moment of rage, a life forever changed, and a single devastating question that still lingers: could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had just listened a little sooner? 36. Leslie Ann Wallace. Leslie Ann Wallace was 39 years old when she shattered the lives of her family and community in a series of devastating acts that would forever define her name. A U.S. Marine Corps veteran and mother of 3, Wallace lived in North Fort Myers, Florida, where she appeared at least to some as a woman simply trying to hold her family together. But beneath that surface was a history of mental health struggles, unresolved trauma, and growing emotional isolation. Wallace had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was taking antidepressants at the time of the crimes. Those close to her described a woman who had faced instability and emotional challenges for years. Court documents and family statements reveal she sometimes spoke of witchcraft and adopted the alias Palm Frond, hinting at an internal world increasingly disconnected from reality. On the morning of September 2, 2001, something in Leslie Wallace broke. Her youngest son, 6-year-old James, known affectionately as Buggy, was watching cartoons at home. Without warning, Leslie picked up a 16-gauge shotgun and fired. James died almost instantly. She later told the 911 dispatcher, "I just shot a 6-year-old boy. He's probably dead by now." She added chillingly, "I just regret that I missed my 16-year-old." What followed was a methodical and disturbing attempt to kill her 2 other sons. She drove to the church where her 16-year-old son Kenny was attending services. There, she confronted him outside and fired. The shot struck the Bible in his pocket, sparing his life. Then she went after her 19-year-old son Gregory, trying to lure him from the Pizza Hut where he worked. Thankfully, he had been warned and refused to come outside. Police caught up with Wallace shortly afterward. She fired 1 shot at officers before being wounded and taken into custody. In total, she was hit 6 times. During her 911 call, Wallace said her motive stemmed from ongoing family tension, particularly her mother-in-law's complaints about her sons. But investigators and mental health experts pointed to something deeper, a mental health crisis that had been festering for years. She was charged with first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 8 additional felonies. Initially, her attorneys considered an insanity defense, but court-appointed psychiatric evaluations were inconclusive. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Wallace pleaded no contest in 2003 and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For her estranged husband, Bill Wallace, the pain didn't end in the courtroom. He buried his youngest child, watched his family splinter, and has since spent years trying to reconcile with the aftermath. Though he doesn't hate Leslie, he said, "There is no chance of us getting back together. It'd be like saying James's life was not worth anything." Psychologists cited mental illness, emotional stress, and possible delusional thinking as contributing factors. But no diagnosis could undo the loss. James Wallace was remembered as a cheerful, loving boy, always smiling, always dancing. His classmates wrote letters in his memory. His father keeps his toys and his shirt, a small attempt to hold on to a life that ended far too soon. And as the candles flicker each year on National Children's Memorial Day, one family and one community still asks the question that has no comforting answer. How does a mother reach the point of no return and take her own child with her? 37. Pauline Zeile. Pauline Zeile was 24 years old when her name became synonymous with betrayal. At the time of her arrest, she was a young mother of 3, living in Palm Beach County, Florida. She had no criminal record, held multiple jobs, and appeared to neighbors and acquaintances as an everyday woman trying to raise her family. But behind closed doors, Pauline's life was more complex and eventually more tragic than anyone imagined. Born on June 13, 1970, Pauline had endured a difficult childhood herself. Her mother abandoned her at a young age, and she was later described by the court as someone who had worked hard and had been a caring parent to her 2 young sons. But when her daughter Christina, a child from a previous relationship, came to live with her in the summer of 1994, everything changed. Christina Holt was 7 years old when she moved from Maryland to Florida to live with her mother Pauline and Pauline's second husband, John Zile. Within months, she was dead. On September 16, 1994, Christina was allegedly beaten by John Zile for soiling herself. During the attack, Pauline did nothing to intervene. Prosecutors argued that she stood by as her husband beat the child until she collapsed and stopped breathing. For several days, the couple kept Christina's body hidden in a closet before burying her in a shallow grave behind a shopping center in Tequesta. Rather than tell the truth, Pauline created a chilling falsehood. She went on television tearfully claiming that her daughter had been kidnapped from a women's restroom at a flea market. The community rallied to find Christina until the lie unraveled. Later that month, John Zile confessed and led authorities to the child's grave. Pauline Zile was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. During her trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a mother who failed in her most basic duty to protect her child. While she didn't strike the fatal blow, they argued her inaction was just as deadly. The jury agreed. In April 1995, Pauline was convicted. 2 months later, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She also received additional concurrent sentences for child abuse. At the sentencing, the judge rejected the defense's argument that she was controlled by her husband. Instead, the court emphasized her efforts to cover up the crime, including selling Christina's belongings and helping purchase the shovel used to bury her. Mental health professionals and legal experts noted that Pauline's case set a legal precedent. It was one of the first in the U.S. where a parent was convicted of first-degree murder based solely on the duty to protect a child. Her psychological profile revealed a complex woman not inherently violent, but deeply passive, emotionally conflicted, and afraid. Still, the court found her culpability undeniable. As the courtroom emptied that day, the weight of her choices settled in. Pauline had already lost Christina. Soon after sentencing, she relinquished custody of her 2 sons so they could be adopted into a new life, one untouched by the legacy of that September day. Outside the Tequesta Kmart where Christina was buried, a large white cross still stands among faded toys and weather-worn flowers, and on it, a single message remains legible. "We love you. Rest now, baby, you're at peace." But the question still echoes unanswered. What kind of fear or denial keeps a mother from saving her child? 38. Mariel Bemis. Mariel Bemis was 21 years old when she committed a crime that sent shockwaves through DeKalb County, Georgia. A young mother, a former dance student, and someone who once described herself online as classy, snarky, and artsy, Mariel appeared to be just another woman trying to raise her daughter and build a future. But on February 23, 2014, all of that unraveled in a way no one could have predicted. Mariel was the mother of 3-year-old Layla Bemis. By all appearances, the two shared a close bond. Her social media pages were filled with playful selfies and moments of motherhood. But beneath the curated photos was a young woman battling feelings of rejection, instability, and emotional dependence. Adopted as a child, Mariel reportedly struggled with feelings of abandonment and a desperate need to be loved. The tipping point came after an argument with her boyfriend, Troy Walker. That evening, a dispute erupted over text messages he received from another woman. Words escalated. Troy left the apartment they shared, and Mariel was left alone not just emotionally, but physically with her daughter. She made multiple phone calls to him, but he refused to answer. And then she made a choice that would change her life forever. At some point during that night, Mariel smothered her daughter using a pillow on the bathroom floor. When Troy finally answered one of her calls, he heard her screaming on the other end, "I killed her." He rushed back to the apartment and found Layla unresponsive. He attempted CPR and called 911. Layla was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Police responded quickly, and Mariel Bemis confessed. She admitted to using a pillow to take her daughter's life. Investigators also noted she had attempted to harm herself after the act. Though no history of diagnosed mental illness was made public, those close to the case pointed to signs of emotional instability and a deep reliance on her romantic relationship as a source of self-worth. In court, the prosecution described the act as a direct response to the breakup. Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Dahlia Racine said, "As a mother, I could not begin to understand how and why she would take the life of her innocent child in such a vicious way." During the proceedings, the judge had to ask that children be removed from the courtroom due to the emotional weight of the testimony. On September 11, 2014, Mariel Bemis pleaded guilty to felony murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No trial, no appeals, just a quiet courtroom, and a young woman who took responsibility for a crime that shocked everyone who thought they knew her. Experts and observers alike have tried to make sense of what happened. Was it untreated trauma? Emotional collapse, narcissistic rage masked as heartbreak? Whatever the explanation, the result was irreversible. In the end, the case of Mariel Bemis leaves us with an agonizing silence, the kind only a child's absence can create. And it raises the most painful question of all. What happens when the person a child trusts most becomes the very person they should fear? 39. Tina Resch. Tina Resch was just 14 years old when the world first heard her name. In 1984, she became the center of what the media dubbed the Columbus Poltergeist case, a series of strange, unexplained movements of household objects, including a now infamous photograph of a telephone flying mid-air, brought cameras, reporters, and parapsychologists to her Ohio home. Some believed she had psychokinetic powers. Others saw a troubled teen seeking attention. But less than a decade later, Tina would be in the headlines again, not for paranormal events, but for something far darker, the murder of her 3-year-old daughter. Born on October 23, 1969, Tina was abandoned by her birth parents as an infant. She was later adopted by John and Joan Resch, a couple known for fostering more than 200 children. But Tina's upbringing was far from nurturing. Described as hyperactive, she was often punished with isolation and physical discipline. She struggled in school, acted out at home, and began to show signs of emotional instability. By the time poltergeist activity was reported in her home, many believed Tina was simply crying out for help, the only way she knew how. Her teenage years were turbulent, marked by family conflict, a failed marriage to an abusive man, and a brief attempt at a more stable life. In 1988, Tina gave birth to her daughter, Amber Gail Bennett. Becoming a mother gave Tina purpose, and by many accounts, she genuinely loved her daughter. But life continued to be difficult. She moved frequently, lived in shelters, and sought support from friends, including parapsychologist Dr. William Roll, who had once studied her poltergeist case. In 1992, Tina, now going by her married name Christina Boyer, was living in Carrollton, Georgia, and had begun a new relationship with a man named David Herron. On April 13th, Tina left Amber in Herron's care while she visited a friend. Hours later, Herron called in a panic. Amber was unresponsive. The little girl was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She had suffered internal injuries and bruising that, according to the autopsy, indicated prolonged abuse. Tina and Herron were both arrested. Tina maintained that she had not harmed her daughter and that she'd been away from the home when the fatal injuries occurred. Herron's account shifted several times, but he ultimately admitted to striking the child and molesting her. Still, prosecutors charged Tina with murder, citing her failure to protect Amber and raising the possibility of a death sentence. 2 years later, under pressure and facing the risk of execution, Tina entered an Alford plea, maintaining her innocence but accepting a guilty verdict to avoid a harsher penalty. She was sentenced to life plus 20 years without the possibility of parole. Herron, by contrast, received just 20 years and was eligible for early release. To this day, Tina's case remains a subject of debate. Some believe she was wrongfully convicted, a victim of circumstance and a broken legal system. Others argue she bears responsibility not for delivering the fatal blow, but for allowing her daughter to remain in a dangerous situation. And so the girl, once thought to wield unexplainable powers, now lives in quiet obscurity, serving a life sentence for a crime she insists she did not commit. Was Tina Resch truly the architect of her child's fate? Or just one more casualty in a life marked by chaos, trauma, and loss?